chapter 7 I should have announced last week. I basically just missed it and forgot about it. So there was supposed to be a quiz based on the syllabus today, and I didn't announce it last week. I realized last night that this has happened. At that point, I don't know. I probably should have posted an announcement. Did anybody spend an enormous amount of time studying for this thing? Oh, thank God. Okay, so like this was my thing I was worried about, is that I just totally screwed over your evening. So in any case, I think at this point there just won't be a quiz for chapter 7, but I do apologize for that. The plan for today is we're going to continue with chapter 8, which is our Principles of Communication chapter. So we'll continue on with the story of hyenas and pseudopenises and this kind of thing in just a few minutes. And then we'll proceed into talking about the homework. And then term papers are due, term paper outlines are technically due tonight, but I told you guys last week that's kind of a soft deadline. If you need another day or two, that's fine. I would appreciate it if it could come in sometime this week. And certainly you have your, the midterms are going to be distributed on Thursday, and so because of that, you're not going to have much time, I would think, this weekend. So it'd be good to get them in this week. Yes, ma'am?
Do you want us to let you know if we're turning in late, or
Yeah, I mean, just sometime this week is fine. I mean, I get like a notice from Canvas that says, hey, this thing was turned in late. And I'll just kind of shrug my shoulder and say, okay, that's fine. The key thing is that, because I'm not actually going to grade them until you come to my office and I want to talk to you about them. So please do that. I've talked to a couple of you already in some detail about outlines. So if you did that, please just make a note of that when you submit. I will probably remember, like I know I talked to you and we talked a bit. But just remind me of that when you submit. But in most cases, I haven't talked to anybody yet because they're not due yet. Thursday, you do have a lab report for the crayfish lab, and then I'm planning to distribute exam number 2, which means I have to write exam number 2, but it's going to be covering chapters 5 through 8, which is, chapter 5 is the genetics, not genetics, that's not right. It is the hormonal chapter. I forget the title of the thing. Physiological basis of behavior might have been. And then it's, why am I having so much trouble? Finding places to live. So it's migration, territoriality. It is, there's another one in there. And then it's also this communication chapter. Sorry. That's terrible. It's not like I don't know what we're going over. Territoriality. Avoiding predators and finding food. That's the other one. So it will be that sort of set of chapters. It'll be very similar format to the last one. In terms of the types of questions, I think you can expect it to be fairly similar. And then I do think we'll be able to start in on chapter 9, which is a reproductive behavior chapter, which is always that's probably like always been my single favorite topic, is trying to understand reproductive behavior in animals, just because they're so weird and they do lots of cool things. Next week, then, the exam will be due on Tuesday, and we'll continue on with that stuff. There won't be a homework assignment due Tuesday. There won't be anything else due Tuesday aside from the exam. Any questions? All right, let me close this door. It's getting loud. Okay, so if you remember where we were trying to understand this weird pseudopenis structure, which is like this massively enlarged clitoris that hyenas have. And one argument that I think we put forth is that a way that hyenas could develop a pseudopenis is if the embryos are exposed to elevated testosterone levels during development. Either embryos or fetuses, and that might trigger them to develop along a male pathway versus a female pathway. And we talked about, at least in like human development, just because it's a nice example of a mammal, that the main trigger that causes at least external genitalia to develop along the male trajectory is exposure to testosterone, which is usually generated by the testes of the developing fetus. In this case, the argument is, well, maybe the mothers have elevated testosterone, and then that is then exposed to the developing fetus, and that then results in them developing a pseudopenis. And so one prediction you would make from this is that pregnant mothers should have elevated testosterone, right? So we should be able to go out and measure pregnant females and see whether or not they actually do have elevated testosterone. And they kind of do. So this is a depiction of blood testosterone levels comparing males and females. And what you can see is that if you look, here are males, just to kind of give you an idea of the ranges of testosterone titers that you see in males. They do vary all over the place. There's certainly quite a lot of variations. So these immigrant males, these are kind of solitary males. These guys have really high testosterone titers up above 1 nanogram per mil, whereas typical adult males that are part of a society are quite a bit lower. They're more, about 0.35 or so nanograms per mil. But that gives you an idea of where males range. Here's females. And what you see is that lactating females actually have pretty low testosterone levels, which is kind of interesting. But pregnant females do, in fact, have testosterone titers that are on par, at least, with that of males that are part of typical society. So sort of the lower bound of males overlaps with the upper bound of females in terms of testosterone levels. And these are pregnant females. So these are females that are potentially exposing their fetuses to developing testosterone. So this is supportive of this idea that maybe it's kind of a byproduct. You have elevated testosterone in the female, maybe that helps them to compete within their hierarchies and be aggressive and all the things they need to do. But then there's this byproduct where, okay, but their fetuses are then exposed to testosterone. There's some problems with this. So like this was like the first story explaining the pseudopenis of the hyena, but there are some problems with this. One of them is that the female's placenta also produces an enzyme that does a pretty good job of inactivating any androgens. And androgens are the kinds of hormones that testosterone fits under. So testosterone or anything like testosterone tends to get inactivated by this enzyme in the placenta. So while the female may have elevated testosterone, in order for that hormone to get into to get to the fetus, it has to go through the placenta. And there are enzymes there that basically inactivate it, especially during the critical period where you're making a decision about whether or not to develop as female versus male in terms of your external genitalia. Furthermore, you can actually do people have actually done an experiment where they've taken anti-androgens that will basically mask and block any testosterone or other androgens that are present. If you expose if you introduce these anti-androgen compounds during those early stages of development of a just pregnant female, it does not prevent the females from the female offspring from developing a pseudopenis. So these things are kind of contradictory then, right? So like we do have this elevated testosterone level, but it doesn't seem to be the thing that's causing the pseudopenis, because here we're actually experimentally blocking the testosterone from ever getting to the fetus. And even then, they develop a pseudopenis. So if that's true, I think it's indicative that we're not just dealing with a byproduct here, where it's kind of like an accident, and whoops, sorry, we made a pseudopenis that you have to give birth through and mate through and all that sort of thing. And instead, maybe it's serving some specific function, where, so we're getting to have a little bit more of a mechanism behind the development of the thing. So we need to figure out why this thing evolved then. So if it's not a byproduct, we need to treat this as a trait that would have then been favored by selection. And if we're going to do that, I think we need to start thinking about costs and benefits of this pseudopenis and really try to lay out, what are the costs, what are the benefits? And the costs, as the video kind of alluded to, are many. So this thing is really, I think, a real puzzle. So for example, one thing, well, we did sort of mention that it can result in these sort of changes in development. But in addition, so this is something that does happen in females. If you have androgen, happen in females. It does happen in humans that if you do have androgen exposure, if a woman has elevated testosterone levels, and this can happen, that can lead to an enlarged clitoris and then developing female offspring. But it can also lead to sterility, and so you would expect elevated androgens to potentially cause a sterility problem. So that's a potential cost, even if androgens are involved, which we're kind of being skeptical about. I think the biggest costs, though, are like the things having to do with the reproductive tract of these poor guys. So this is this is a spotted hyena, and they've kind of cartoon drawn over her reproductive tract. Let me dim the lights a little bit in the front so you can see it better. There we go. So, like, oh my God. All right, so here's how big her uterus would be when she's pregnant. Like, normally it would be down like this, but if it's pregnant, this is her uterus. So there's the cervix, here's the vagina, and like normally, you know, you just kind of go to here and then you're done. And so it's like a straight shot, right? And humans aside, most of the time birthing isn't that traumatic of an event. You know, humans tend to have a really hard birthing, and that's because our babies have such large heads relative to the size of the vaginal canal. But that's not necessarily true for all mammals. But look what they have to do. Instead of the birth canal basically ending right here at the end of the vagina, instead you have to do like literally almost 180-degree turn. It's like 100 and I don't know what, like 50 degrees? And then come back out this way and then go through, actually through the clitoris, and you give birth through that structure. I mean, it's just wacky crazy. About 10% of all females die the first time they attempt to birth a pup. So like that's an incredible cost. And then their offspring, because they have to like go through this, they have to get twisted and contorted, and I mean they're like tumbling down, and it's not a tumble. It's, you know, they're being squeezed and pushed and coerced. About 60% of all their firstborn offspring die. So there's a huge cost to this, huge reproductive cost to this. There's survival cost to the female. There's reproductive costs in terms of their offspring dying. This is a bizarro structure. And on top of that, you know, mating's difficult, as we saw. I mean, they can do it, but it does take some time, and that time could be spent doing other things. It is time when they are otherwise not foraging, not resting, not relaxing, not doing other sorts of things that might be relevant to them. So there's got to be some benefits then. If this is not just a byproduct, and if this is a costly kind of a structure, there must be some sort of benefits that are associated with this. So a couple arguments that have been put forth. One argument is kind of still sort of relying on this idea of something about this being kind of a byproduct, but it's not just, you know, strictly related to the androgens. In any case, one argument is that it's not the pseudopenis itself, it's associated traits. So aggression could be really important to hyena's social structure, and it does seem to be really important. Because if you are doing really well in terms of your social status, and maybe that's at least in part favored by aggression, then you're likely to have better access to food, and you're likely to have better survivorship and success of your individual offspring. So, for example, these are data that are just sort of describing the social structure as opposed to something specifically about aggression. But here on the x-axis, this is maternal social status. Okay, so the idea would be if you're a 0, that means you're kind of like of intermediate social status within the dominance hierarchy. If you have a high social status, then this would be like you're the alpha female within the group. If you're down here, you're kind of a subservient lower peon at the bottom of the totem pole. And then this is a depiction of, this is cubs surviving. And so what we're seeing is a relatively low percentage of cubs that actually survive. I mean, look at these numbers. So this is, you know, if you're on the low end of the social status, you're only having about 25% of your cubs survive. Whereas if you're of higher social status, it's not great, but you're all the way up to about 50% of your cubs surviving. So that's double the survivorship of your offspring just by being of higher social status. And in part, this is probably due to access to food, because those that are of higher social status get to feed first, and that includes your cubs. So if your pups or your cubs are with you, they get to feed along with you on the kills the first. Similarly, this seems to be a strongly inherited kind of a system, the social statuses, such that if you are of high social status, your offspring, your female offspring, will also tend to be of high social status. And this could be directly because there's kind of an inheritance thing. It could also be just because they got good conditions growing up, and so they grow up to be strong and tough and able to compete within the group, and as a result, they achieve high social status as well. So this is daughter social status, and you can see there's just a very, very tight relationship. I know there's some scat over here, but this is behavior data. Like behavior data are noisy. This is beautiful in terms of a relationship. There's a really tight relationship between the mother's social status and her daughter's eventual social status. And furthermore, there's also direct implications in terms of your ability to reproduce. So if you are of high social status, I don't know why they kind of reversed the scale here, but high maternal rank, which is now over on this side of the curve, is associated with earlier age of first reproduction. So you're getting, if you are of high social status, you get to start reproducing at about your 5th year. Whereas if you're a peon down at the bottom, you might have to wait 2 more years to reproduce, which means that's going to reduce your lifetime reproductive success. So all of this is indicating that social status is super, super, super important for females within these populations, right? It's going to result in more offspring and higher quality offspring that are able to do better themselves within their particular social groups. So one argument is that if there's something about aggression that helps you do that, you know, and if testosterone helps you do that, well, maybe that's associated, or that might be a reason why the pseudopenis would be favored. But again, we've got these problems where we seem to have, you know, this lack of a connection actually between testosterone and the pseudopenis, where, you know, if you actually experimentally try to block testosterone, it doesn't seem to inhibit the pseudopenis. So maybe there's something else going on here where something about the pseudopenis is impacting social status. I think I'm just going to plant that seed. But before we go there, I got ahead of myself a little bit. Before we go there, let's just think about this. I mean, it could be a situation where maybe those experiments with testosterone blockings really were wrong, and that it really is more of a byproduct. So if we go with this byproduct hypothesis, maybe it is that we've got a trait where, you know, where benefits associated with being aggressive are outweighing the costs of having the pseudopenis, despite the fact that we're consistently paying. Maybe the pseudopenis isn't needed. It's just that we have to be really aggressive. There is a problem, just more fundamental problem with this idea of this byproduct hypothesis, where you have a costly trait that serves no function, but it's associated with some other traits. And that is that in breeding studies, before I get to breeding, and that is that if the pseudopenis is so costly and doesn't have any function in and of itself, wouldn't selection promote any possible decoupling of that trait to the unfavored trait? So, you know, could we get rid of the pseudopenis and still maintain the aggressive titers of testosterone and all the aggression that we need? Yeah, go ahead.
The video that we watched mentioned that it reduces chance of rape and stuff like that.
Right.
Is that an associated trait, or is that a direct?
So that would be a direct benefit of having the pseudopenis, is if you are able to prevent rape and therefore you're able to exert control over your reproduction. So there, I think that would be a case, and I'm kind of slowly getting to that, because yeah, I think that would be a situation where the pseudopenis really serves a particular function as opposed to being just kind of a byproduct.
That's the only direct benefit
that it mentioned. I think you're right. I think there's another angle on it that we can take, but yeah, I think that would be sort of one category of explanations, that the pseudopenis itself is necessary. I do want to just dispatch this last little bit, because this last little bit is saying, all right, so maybe the pseudopenis isn't important, but it's other correlated traits that just happen to also result in the pseudopenis. So here's the thing. If you have a really expensive, costly trait, and it's correlated to some other traits that are really advantageous, you really would expect selection to be able to decouple those at some point. Even if they're sort of fundamentally linked by testosterone within development, eventually you might expect them to be able to be separated from each other. And that is because any kind of breeding study with agricultural, any kind of agricultural study, looking at breeding of plants, breeding of animals, the dog breeding studies, pigeon breeding studies, rabbit breeding studies. I'm going to show you a butterfly breeding study. Anytime you have traits that might be apparently just like beautifully correlated with each other under the same kinds of genetic controls, If you apply selection to it for long enough, eventually you can get those traits to be separated. So I always like this example. This is from this paper by Patricia Beldade. So I guess it's getting a little bit old, 2002. But she was looking at a butterfly. This was directly in sort of my field, so that's why I kind of like it. But it's a really nice example where she was studying eye spots on these butterflies. And the question was whether or not these, first of all, was whether or not these things were genetically correlated. And based on preliminary prior studies, they had found that basically the same genes controlled eye spot size for this anterior eye spot as well as this posterior eye spot. So if you got large posterior eye spot alleles, they would also cause large anterior eye spot alleles. So these seem to be very tightly developmentally coupled to each other. They were developmentally constrained, where one gene, or where the same genes seem to control the size of each of the different traits. She was interested in, can we separate those two? Can we decouple one trait from the other? And this was a case where it seemed as though they were very tightly correlated. So she just did a straight up artificial selection experiment. So, this is where you're just, it's kind of like Mendel would do. You're just sort of breeding. You're choosing who gets to survive each generation. And so there's sort of three parts. There's three different areas to this, this graph. And these are I said three. There are four different parts to the graph. And these are four different lineages that she created in the lab. So up here, these letters sort of indicate what she was trying to do. Up here, every generation, she would take like the top 20%. She'd measure all the individuals. And she'd take those that had both the top 20% anterior eye spot and posterior eye spot. So she's going for big anterior and big posterior eye spots. So this was her starting point. And then each of these dots is a subsequent generation. And you can see by breeding and selecting for this trait, each generation, always picking those that had the biggest anterior and posterior eye spots, she got progressively larger and larger posterior eye spot size and anterior eye spot size. So they got bigger and bigger and bigger on both eye spots, which should be expected because they're genetically coupled and she's selecting on them. Down here, she was selecting for those that had smaller eye spots in each case. So small anterior spots and small posterior spots. And each generation, they got smaller. Again, that's to be expected. Those are kind of her controls. Over here, what she tried to do is select for individuals that had small anterior but large posterior eye spots. And there really wasn't much variation for her to work with, but she basically looked for those that sort of maximized the difference between the posterior and the anterior eye spots, such that anterior eye spots were small, posterior eye spots were large. And what you can see is, while it doesn't, you can see how quickly the line went down over here. It's kind of noisy and it doesn't move real fast. Each subsequent generation didn't change that much. But she eventually was able to create individuals by this selection process over the course of, something like 15 generations that had small anterior eye spots and large posterior eye spots. So this is anterior eye spot size went down, posterior eye spot size went up. So she could do it. It's harder. It takes more time because they were tightly genetically coupled to each other, but she was able to separate those two traits. And the same was true when she tried to select for individuals that had large anterior and small posterior eye spots. It took a while. It was kind of noisy. They didn't move as quickly, but she was able to create large anterior, small posterior eye spot butterflies over the course of something like 15 generations. So this is one example of many studies that have tried to look at whether or not developmental constraints can sort of prevent evolution from happening or prevent some decoupling of traits. And we've consistently found that whenever there's a really costly trait that doesn't provide any kind of advantage, and then there's another trait that is advantageous, even if they're initially coupled to each other, you can separate them. And it's, it seems as though organisms tend to be very labile in terms of what you can cause them to do. Does that make sense? Either the butterfly story or what we're trying to do with the hyenas. Yes, sir. Flexible, adjustable, moldable. I'm thinking like silly putty is labile. Right.
Kind of funny. Of all the things you've said so far, that was the part that tripped me.
That's fine. Yeah. So we're selection is, I think the take home is selection is incredibly powerful, and you can basically create anything you want, which is what you see when you look at breeds of dogs and such. I mean, just like, the absurdity of dogs is great. Yeah.
So is there any significance to the large anteriors by evolving and the post anterior spot evolving in a very noisy fashion?
Like here, like how it is kind of noisy and up and down and not just like a nice quick linear. I think, yeah, I think there is significance in that what you're seeing is that it is more difficult for them to separate because they originally were very tightly genetically correlated to each other. And it took some time for genes, for the few genes that would allow them to separate to really have much of an effect. So you don't see rapid evolution. So I think this is where I'm sort of saying these developmental constraints, where you have traits that are tightly developmentally coupled to each other, they can slow down evolution. They can make it take longer, but eventually you'll get them separated. So the application of all this is that if pseudopenises are super, super costly, which they seem to be, they seem to have substantial cost to them, and if they don't have some substantial benefits in and of themselves, like we were just starting to speculate on, then they should just go away. Like, selection should be able to eventually take care of that because they are so costly. Any possible little mutation that might occur, or any possible little variation that exists within the population that allow you to get rid of the pseudopenis while maintaining the aggression or whatever other characteristics are advantageous, those would be promoted by selection. So the story then is there's got to be some benefit to having a pseudopenis. So what could that be? So here's a scenario that your book lays out. It's not the argument about rape or control over one's own copulation, enforcement of females being able to make choices about who they're going to mate with. It's slightly different, but it has to do, the argument is that it has to do with something about the communication system within these dominant hierarchies, because we've already seen how important dominance hierarchies are to these animals. So imagine that we already had a hierarchy existing within some ancestral spotted hyena, and there was a dominant female on top. If you look at what males do, the behavior within this particular group is that males will, as an act of submission, they will present an erect penis. This is just, this is how hyenas seem to operate, such that when they interact with each other, if a male is trying to present themselves as a submissive individual, they kind of get low. They sort of hunker their heads down, but they also present an erect penis, and that seems to be a signal, a communication signal within these organisms that demonstrates that they have an active, demonstrates that they are submissive. If males are already using that signal within the system, then any female that can also show that same kind of a system may also be able to demonstrate submissiveness, which would allow her to get into the society and become part of a group potentially. So if a female had an engorged pseudopenis, which is basically just an engorged clitoris, if it was a little bit larger than usual, that may aid her in terms of being able to gain acceptance in the clan by showing submissiveness. Because even being a low rank individual within a clan, while we already saw that you're not doing as well as the dominant individuals, those individuals do still tend to do better than solitary spotted hyena females roaming around. So being in a clan, even at low rank, is usually better than being alone. The dominant female also benefits within this group because then she can evaluate the degree of potential threat of submissive females by using these penis signals. So, and certainly this is consistent. We saw this in the video. These individuals, whenever they go up to each other, they immediately go around and they sniff and they investigate, and they're probably visually also evaluating this pseudopenis. So it seems to be a really important part of their communication system. So an argument is that the main benefit, despite all those costs to the pseudopenis, the main benefit is that this has become a fundamental signal that these animals use to evaluate submissiveness and dominance, and it promotes integration and communication within the social group. So we have benefits in communication that are outweighing substantial costs associated with the pseudopenis. That's an argument. I would say it's probably not totally solved. I think some of these arguments I think are also really interesting about being able to control reproduction from a female standpoint, because we see a lot of in other animals those are also enforced traits, and this is highly advantageous for a female to actually exert female choice. So moths, for example, are very good at being able to do this. Not that they have a pseudopenis, but they have their own special adaptations that permit that kind of thing. Okay, so again, the argument is there must be some substantial benefits, and they're probably associated with communication in the case of the hyenas that outweigh these really substantial costs. And it does sort of indicate how important communication is to the reproductive success of these individuals, because again, you've got to outweigh all those horrible costs associated with having this structure. Okay, so those two examples that we talked about honeybees last time, and we talked about the spotted hyenas communication systems. Those are meant to sort of set up and get you thinking about different kinds of communication systems. What I want to do for most of the rest of today's lecture component is to be talking about how is it that these communication systems evolve. And there are two different hypotheses that I want to highlight. I'm kind of doing it in a different order than your book does, in a slightly different way, but these to me are maybe two of the most fundamental hypotheses that we use to try to explain how is it that a communication system happens to be. So what I mean when I say communication system, I'm talking about the particular traits and the signals that are used within a species to communicate some information within that species. So these are the honest signaling hypothesis, and then this sort of idea of pre-existing biases and the sensory exploitation hypothesis. And these are, I think, two rather different explanations that both explain why an individual population might be using a particular signal within their group. So again, this first one is this honest signals hypothesis. So to set this up, I want to talk about these European toads. They don't usually have weapons, but they do. I don't know where I found this, but I thought it was funny. But this is the idea, is that we're looking at these little toads, and these guys certainly do spar. They usually don't spar too much physically, though. They do a lot of acoustic communication, and then sometimes there are physical confrontations. We see this across many different organisms, that many animals have aggressive encounters between each other within a species that do not result in injury and very rarely result in death, but they do strongly influence important things about individuals' lives. For example, do you get to mate or not? So again, we'll talk about these European toads as an example. Like most frogs, anurans, European toads will basically ride on females. It's called emplexus. So when a male finds a female who is gravid, has lots of eggs, she's approaching a time when she's going to be laying them, they literally basically just jump on their backs and grab hold and hold on, like with a death grip, literally sometimes a death grip, where the males will, there actually are cases I've heard of where males have actually died and still been attached to the female. So it's not entirely clear that the female's benefiting from this, but this is basically what the males will do. If another male comes along after a male has sort of found a female and has gotten himself on her back, he will croak. And I do not mean die in that case. I mean he will actually make an audible noise if another male tries to disturb them. And oftentimes that croak alone will be enough to repel the competitor before the competitor ever tries to even push them off. So the question might be, if you're an approaching male and you run into another male that's on top of a female, and she may be a really healthy-looking female, lots of eggs. You can sort of tell she's very close to laying. This is the time then you would get to fertilize her eggs. And again, the idea is that they do external fertilization. So the female releases the eggs, and then the male basically releases his sperm directly over top of the eggs right as she's laying them. So why would you want to be repelled by a croak? I mean, why not just kind of see if you can still push the bastard off of her, and maybe you can still muscle him off, and then you get a mating opportunity. Why would just be, you hear a croaker and like, oh, all right, you made a noise, so I'm going to back off. What would be the benefit to the retreating toad to just sort of giving up at that point, do you think? Yeah, what do you think?
The overall benefit to not being, I guess, injured, with the males already on the female is still better than the benefit of trying to keep it in place in the female.
Yeah, so you may be, so why be repelled? One argument is that by doing so, by allowing yourself to be repelled, by retreating, you can avoid injury. And with that, we could put energetic costs, these kinds of things. So that's certainly a benefit. On the other hand, I mean, you got to mate, right? So like, at some point, got to throw down maybe. So why would a croak convince you not to challenge one male, and maybe another male you might be more willing to challenge? Like, what kind of information could that convey, do you think? What do you think? All right, so maybe you're getting kind of a preview for what would be likely to happen if you did try to engage in physical confrontation. So maybe the croak tells you something about the size or vigor or health of that individual. So by listening to the croak, you can get information without ever actually having to engage in physical conflict. And here's an experiment they did to try to actually demonstrate this. So in this experiment, they had a bunch of frogs, and they silenced all the males. So in no case was a male actually able to emit his own croak. Instead, what they would do is that at the appropriate time, when they staged encounters between males, with one male on another female, and then there's an encroaching male, they would play the sound of a croak, but they could then vary and manipulate the pitch of that call. And there is variation within the species in terms of the pitch of the call. And here's what they found. So when you stick a small little toad, so this is a small male on a female, and then you have another male come up and encroach on him, if you play a high-pitched croak, so sort of a croak sort of a noise, he almost always gets attacked. So there was lots and lots of attacks in that circumstance. And then the percentage of time that the encroaching male spent attacking was very, very high in that circumstance. If instead you played a low croak, kind of an imposing, manly, I guess, kind of a croak, when you do that, they pretty rarely got attacked. They still got attacked some of the time, but they, certainly far more rarely were ever attacked, and there was far less effort spent, far less time spent attacking those individuals. And again, all the time, it's the same kind of a male. It's a small defender. What you're varying is the acoustic signal that the encroaching male hears on the speaker that it presumably thinks is coming from that male. In contrast, if you have a large defender, again, these guys aren't allowed to call within the signal themselves. You're playing on a microphone or on a speaker. You're choosing what sound they play. It's already a large defender, but if you play a high-pitched croak, they get attacked more often than if you play a low-pitched, sort of loud, imposing, kind of a croak, as opposed to the croak, sort of a sound. So it's not the only trait that matters. There clearly are other. It's clear that the encroaching males also could tell something about the size of this male just by maybe its visual investigation as well, because the smallest defender always got attacked more than the largest defender, no matter what call they were hearing. But within a category of defender size, you consistently found that that when the encroaching male heard a low-pitched croak, that would cause them to attack less often. To which I think the immediate question would be, all right, so if I'm a toad, and especially if I'm a small little toad, and I know I'm likely to get attacked pretty often anyway, why wouldn't I make a low-pitched croak, right? So it would certainly benefit this male if he could produce this low-pitched croak. And the argument is he probably can't. So this is probably an honest signal in the case of these toads, and then also in many other organisms where the males, or in some cases it's females, make some sort of a loud vocalization that's used as sort of an intimidation signal. And the reason is, acoustically, in order for the toads, for example, to produce a low-pitched croak, they need to have kind of a large chamber of air, basically, that will allow for the resonance at the appropriate frequencies to produce that low-pitched croak. Small individuals just don't have large enough chambers in order to produce that sort of a sound. And so as a result, they can't produce a low-pitched croak. I don't have data from a toad, but I do have data from this little barking gecko. So this is an indication. This is the barking gecko's length in millimeters of a bunch of different males. And then this is the dominant frequency of their croak, or their bark in this case. And what you can see is that the small individuals produce a higher pitched bark than do the low-pitched individuals. And this is really, really common. So it's very often the case that you've got sort of an acoustic signal, when animals are using acoustic signals, that relays information about body size, and it does so in an honest manner because you just literally can't produce the other kind of a call. If you are small, you can't produce the low pitch. This is sometimes called a production cost, where there's basically the cost where you have to build a large body size, in this case, in order to produce the low-pitched croak. Those individuals that are smaller just haven't been able to pay that cost, or they haven't been able to pay it yet, at least, and they haven't grown to the point that they're able to produce the lower pitch. So it's certainly beneficial to the large individuals to produce the low-pitched croak. And thereby they will tend to win their contests. And it's also beneficial to all the encroaching individuals because they can get accurate information about the encroaching individuals. And so for all these reasons, this seems to be a perpetuated signal where selection is favoring this honest signal. Selection will, the idea is, I'll just to sort of finish that thought, the idea is that if a signal was not honest, so if a signal didn't provide accurate information, very quickly, I think selection would favor individuals that just ignore that dishonest signal because it's just not providing useful info. Selection will tend to favor honest signals because, and paying attention to honest signals because those are the signals that provide useful information to the receiver. And so we tend to see a lot of the signals that animals use tend to be pretty honest in their structure. And we talk more about those in the homework. Any questions on honest signaling? All right, I want to take a short break. So I'm at 10:13. Let's come back at 10:18. So we'll do 5 minutes and we'll talk about pre-existing biases and the sensory exploitation hypothesis and hopefully get to start the homework. Okay. So if one explanation, I'm going to go restart. If one explanation for why you might use a particular signal within a particular species is that it provides honest information. Another explanation that's kind of a different sort of motivation to it is that a signal may be used within a particular species because of pre-existing biases, and this leads to this sensory exploitation hypothesis. And I always like this example as a sort of a nice way to introduce this idea. So these are water mites. They're maybe not the most attractive little animals. They're like little arachnids, and you can see they look like little spiders, really. In this case, these are not the brightest animals on the block, right? So these are they have relatively simple nervous systems, relatively simple sensory systems, and so the question is, how is it that if you're a male, how are you going to get a female's attention? Certainly, one of the immediate things I think that you might expect selection to do is that if you produce a signal that mimics something else that the female's already paying attention to, that's going to make it easier for her to notice you and therefore more likely to mate with you ultimately, assuming that you don't get eaten or devoured in the process. So in the case of these water mites, Females will do this sort of sit and wait hunting thing. This is called net stance behavior. So this is the female. And so she basically will just sort of assume this position and wait for some little copepod to come sort of swarming around in front of her, at which point she'll pounce and grab it and eat it. And this is how she goes through her hunting process. Males, when they encounter a female, they kind of creep up to her and they take one of their little feet and they just kind of waggle it right in front of her, which is right about the same frequency of a little swimming copepod that's going right in front of her. And as a result, he will sometimes get her attention. She will then pounce on him. And then if she pounces on him, he can turn around really quickly and then release spermatophores, which is what you're seeing down here. So these are not eggs. These are actually spermatophores that he's released onto the surface, which she can then grab and consume. And as she does so, she acquires nutrients, but she also receives the sperm of this particular male. And so the argument here is that there's sort of two things going on, right? On one hand, he's sort of taking advantage of certain biases that she has in her nervous system. Her nervous system is already tuned to little wiggles right in front of her face. This is, so this is vibrations in the water column that she's probably sensing. There could be some visual aspect to it, although I don't think these guys have much in the way of eyes. But she's already associating or already pay attention to those kinds of stimuli. So the male is kind of exploiting those pre-existing biases, right? He's taking advantage of the fact that she's already paying attention to this, and by doing so, he's able to get her to mate with him, at least some of the time. That little argument, so the argument would be that we'd expect once the female adopts this net stance behavior and is paying attention to this particular signal, the males then would subsequently, after that, benefit from having this sort of courtship behavior where they're waving their feet in front of the female. So if you go and look on, there are a couple predictions that we can make. One is that females should be more responsive to male stimuli when they're motivated to eat. So if females are hungry, they're paying attention to that stimulus more often. If the male then comes up to them and wags their feet in front of them, females should be more likely to respond to that encroaching signal. And they are. So when females are hungry, they also tend to be more receptive to males and more likely to mate with males. So it does seem to work. Furthermore, from a comparative standpoint, across these animals, we should see that male trembling behavior should probably evolve after the net stance predatory behavior evolves in the females. So if we go across, this is just one species of water mite, but if we look at all these different species of water mites and we find where does female net stance behavior evolve, we should see that the male trembling behavior should evolve after that. And so this is this kind of mapping exercise we've done before. So here are all these different species of water mites. It doesn't really matter which ones are which. These are major groups of them, but each of these is a different species. And it turns out that there's two equally likely mappings of these traits based on the characteristics that are up here. This is one mapping, and in this case, it's not real helpful. This one basically shows that net stance and trembling basically co-evolved at the same point right here in the phylogeny, and that trembling must have been lost here. But there's another equally likely scenario that has the same number of evolutionary steps. This basically is 1, 2, 3 steps. This one also has 3 steps. And this one is saying that net stance behavior evolved right here. And then trembling must have evolved here and here. So if, at least under this scenario, this is consistent with this idea that net stance evolves first, the predatory behavior evolves first, females start paying attention to little wiggles in front of them, and then subsequently males sort of wag their feet in front of them. This is not inconsistent with that idea, but it's not as clearly supportive of it either. There's some language though, so I've been saying that there's pre-existing biases, and then males are kind of exploiting the sensory biases of the female. So I think that language is a little bit loaded, and you could sort of ask, so if females are therefore being exploited, so if males are exploiting the females' biases, why don't the females then stop paying attention to that signal? Why don't they evolve resistance? And in some cases, females, it's not really clear that they need to. So a lot of times it probably is actually beneficial to the female to kind of go along with this particular scenario. So certainly in this process, by males doing this little courtship behavior, the females are getting the opportunity to mate, which eventually, females do need to mate. They don't need to mate or necessarily want to mate or are not favored to mate as often as males, but they certainly have gotten the opportunity to mate and fertilize their eggs. Males that have exaggerated characteristics that are facilitating these kinds of exploitive behaviors often tend to have pretty good genes. They have to be healthy in order to generate the appropriate signals to get females engaged. And so as a result, again, they may have better genes, they may have lower parasite loads, so they're healthier, they may have access to better resources, so they may be better quality males. And so this actually may be, as it turns out, kind of a screening system whereby females can be assured of getting at least a decent quality male by requiring males to go through this process. And furthermore, there's this idea, I always like the name of this hypothesis, it's called the sexy sons hypothesis, where it's maybe less obvious how it applies in this case, but if by mating with a male that has particular traits, your male offspring will also get to have those traits, and that will give them an advantage in mating in their lifetimes, it's actually advantageous to you to mate with that male and secure those advantageous genes for your offspring. So the female is benefiting because she is now going to have sexy sons. In this case, that would mean sons that are capable of doing the little, the trembling behavior in front of the females, and therefore securing more mating opportunities. So a lot of times I tend to think, we'll use this term exploitation, but I'm not sure that really means that there's sort of a negative for the female. It very well could be that this is just the system they've happened to use. It does take advantage of certain pre-existing biases in the female, but she's not necessarily suffering by this. This could be a perfectly acceptable thing from her perspective and perfectly beneficial thing for her from her perspective, despite the word exploited having, sort of seeming so loaded. There are other cases where that's probably not true, where the female may actually be being coerced or may be making mating decisions that she would otherwise not benefit from, and that males are sort of taking advantage of this. In some cases, for example, resistance might do more harm than good. So in the case of the water mites, if starting to resist the male trembling behavior, maybe that would give you some benefits in terms of being able to choose who you're going to mate with a little bit more overtly. But it could be that avoiding the trembling behavior might also mean that you're less good at hunting, right? Because the trembling stimulus is basically the same stimulus as your food, and you don't want to start ignoring your food. So in that case, resistance might actually do more harm than good for her, in that she might not hunt as effectively, and therefore her survivorship could be impaired. Other times, it may just be a flat out sort of a matter of coercion, and then it's kind of a cost-benefit analysis for the females. Do you deal with the coercion and try to resist them, or do you just sort of give in so you can move on with your life? So for example, garter snakes have this sort of anti-predator defense where if they are grabbed by a predator, they will do something called cloacal gaping, where they will open their cloacas. They'll usually release some feces or other sorts of materials, and that is sometimes helpful in terms of helping them to get away from the predator, because it will surprise the predator. Predators don't like getting feces squirted in their mouths, that kind of a thing. Male garter snakes, though, so the garter snakes tend to overwinter in these hibernacula with huge numbers of snakes. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of snakes in one little hole in the ground, and then they'll all kind of come out at once. And oftentimes males will try to mate with any females as they emerge. And so the females will basically be trying to slither away as quickly as they can from these sort of big conglomerations of garter snakes. And the males will just be basically trying to grab onto them and slither and swarm around them. And effectively, they're almost trying to crush them. It sort of seems as though they're doing that. As they impair the breathing of the female snakes, it induces the females then to undergo cloacal gaping, which is sort of an anti-predator defense. But at that moment, the males use that cloacal opening. So as the females open their cloaca, the males will then insert their intromittent organ, their penis effectively, at that moment. And therefore, this facilitates the mating of the male. It's not necessarily clear that the female's benefiting in any way from this particular behavior. But if she were, for example, to cease cloacal gaping, I think you could assume, perhaps one of two things could happen. It could be that she might not use this when she actually needs to use it as an anti-predator defense. So, in this case, that would be doing more harm than good. It also could be the case that the males just might smother her. So at a certain point, just harassment becomes such a problem that you do see females kind of what seems to be just sort of giving in to the males, mating with them so that they can kind of go on their way. You see this a lot of times in butterflies and in damselflies where the males will just basically harass and pursue the females indefinitely. And eventually sometimes females will just sort of say, fine, and you just sort of mate with them and then you can kind of move on with their lives. Maybe not the best moral story, but that is what seems to be happening in those environments. Okay, so we'll come back to some of those ideas shortly when we talk homework. But again, I think this idea of pre-existing biases and sensory exploitation is a pretty neat idea. And it's one that seems to be well supported in a number of different species. But again, exploited doesn't necessarily mean that females are being harmed in this manner. Sometimes they probably are, but sometimes not. Last little ditty I want to talk about is the issue of illegitimate signalers and receivers. So this is kind of asking, how is it that deception can evolve? So in terms of illegitimate signalers, we talked at the beginning, we had this sort of model of there being a signaler and a receiver, where the signaler was sort of intending to produce some sort of communication signal that was received by the receiver, and the receiver got some information from that signal. Here we're talking about illegitimate signalers, where the receiver effectively thinks that it's getting information from one individual, but it's actually getting information from a different individual, usually in some sort of a predator-prey kind of a conflict. So this is basically deception. So selection, we said, should tend to favor receivers that pay attention to honest signals, because those are the most useful signals that are out there. Those are the signals that provide accurate information in your environment. But you still do sometimes see illegitimate signalers exist that are being deceptive. So this is, I think this is always one of my favorite examples, and these are these Photurus fireflies. And this is a little bit, the tricky thing about this example, everything else is cool about it, but the tricky thing about it, where's my markers? I don't know if this one works. Nope. The tricky thing about it is that there's two different species. One of them is called Photurus, and the other one, sorry, I misspelled it. That's important. The other one's called Photinus. And the way this works is that Photurus is this really large firefly here. And she will basically be sitting and perching, and she will be basically watching, apparently, for the visual flashing signals of this other species of Photinus firefly males. So firefly males, they kind of buzz around, they emit a little flashing signal. They're one of the, I mean, I don't know, I grew up with fireflies around, so I think sometimes we kind of get desensitized to how amazing they are, but not everywhere in the world gets to have fireflies. And they are just this magical, incredible thing, I think. That just one of the true, just wonders of evolution, that we have these animals that are able to generate their own light, and they just sort of fly around in our yards at night in July. And I just think that they're really incredible. These Photurus fireflies, though, are basically looking for the particular flashing patterns that are specific to Photinus males. And when they do that, when they see a Photinus male out there flashing in the particular way Photinus males flash, they will start to flash in a way that mimics the signal of a Photinus female. And the result is that a male will kind of cruise in and land next to this Photurus female, and you can see what happens. She jumps on him, and she eats him. So this is a big predatory, nasty firefly. Not nasty, this is just what she does. But she deceives these males and causes them to come in close contact with her. because she is basically pretending to be a female of their own species. She emits the same signal that they produce. It's, you know, it's exactly the same in terms of cadence, in terms of rhythm, and basically in terms of brightness. And ultimately, the males, you know, they perish as a result of paying attention to those signals. There's two major explanations for why males might do this, because this is clearly a suboptimal outcome for the male, right? This is not what the male was responding, at least not what the male, if they could think. This is not what they think they are responding to. They're being deceived in this manner, but you could, certainly there's a question of why is it the males are actually being able to be duped by these females. One is that this is sort of a novel environment problem, where it could be that, you know, maybe these Photurus females have been introduced more recently into contact with the Photinus males. Those Photinus males might not have had time to really evolve the defenses they needed to avoid getting seduced by her. And so it could be that, you know, maybe her mimicry isn't perfect. Maybe there are some things about her signal that could be that Photinus males could pick out, and therefore eventually selection will allow them to avoid predation or avoid being predated by these individuals. I tend to think in this case there's this other argument. It's called the net benefit hypothesis, and that is that the good outcomes from paying attention to the signal outweigh the bad outcomes from paying attention to the signal on average. So this is certainly a bad outcome for this male. This male is done. He is not going to get the opportunity to mate again. I think we can agree on that. However, probably most of the time when he sees the Photinus female signal out in its environment, he usually is going to benefit because he's usually going to follow that signal and find a female that he may be able to mate with. It's just that every once in a while, and you know, it's probably a low percentage of the time, maybe it's only 1% of the time, when he follows that same signal, he's going to end up next to a Photurus female and he's going to get eaten. So I think I kind of like this idea that it's more of a net benefit, that the good outcomes outweigh the bad outcomes. You're kind of weighing on average, or selection really is weighing on average, is this a beneficial trait to respond to? And most of the time, it probably is. It's just that sometimes tragedy ensues. Therefore, the male responses, we would say, are still an adaptive trait, despite the fact that sometimes they have a really deleterious outcome. Okay, so that's illegitimate receivers, or I'm sorry, signalers. There's also an issue of illegitimate receivers. So this is basically the eavesdropper, right? So you're trying to signal to other individuals, and you're trying to carry on a conversation effectively, but someone else eavesdrops on that conversation. When we showed the video of the squid last week, we saw that they actually seem to make efforts to focus the signals such that they're only showing signals on one side of their body, and it's the side that's facing the female, whereas the other side of their body might not actually show that. But you know, here's another example. So this is an example of a Tungara frog. The Tungara frog, I've got a little video just so you can hear it. Of course, I have to fiddle with this for a second, get the sound. Whoops. I might have, okay, good. No. Here we go. Okay. So this is what a Tungara frog sounds like. And you can hear there's kind of a doo, doo, and then there's a part too, right? So they have a kind of a neat little signal. There's sort of little chirps, and then there's these doo sort of noises. All right, stop it. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. So we've got dews and we've got chucks, and the chucks would be the sort of noises that they were making. It is certainly the case that when a male is producing both of those components, when they produce the dew sort of noise, which is this, dew, dew, dew sort of noises, along with the chucks, which is what you're seeing here, those males seem to do the best, and females get most excited. They're most likely to mate with individuals that are making all those different noises. Unfortunately, bats also can listen for those noises. So these bats are not just sensitive to ultrasound, they can also listen to some of these higher frequency chuck noises, and so they can use the chucks to actually hone in on males. And this is one of the great natural history photographs I think I've ever seen, where you've got one of these predatory bats swooping in and just about to grab that frog. It's a poor little guy. He's about to be devoured by this bat. So what you end up seeing is that in environments where bats are around, or where you have high predation risk. So like if you're in a small population, for example, where you have low dilution effect and therefore you have high high risk of predation, you see the individuals, the males basically stop chucking. They just do the doo kind of a noise and give up the chucking altogether, even though that's advantageous for females in terms of seducing females and attracting females. It helps to avoid predation. So it's a very similar thing to like that dugong example, right? Where we have individuals choosing different tactics depending on the predation environment that they exist in. Those tundra frogs that are in low predation environments, so high population sizes, for example, where there's lots of other individuals and they have low predation risk, they will chuck. But then they change their reproductive behavior, their signaling behavior, when there's high predation risk around them. So eavesdropping is a persistent problem anytime you're using some sort of communication system, is the moral. All right. Any questions on any of those? All right. So unfortunately, we've only got 5 minutes left, but I would like you to pull out your homework and start talking through the homework questions. We will start them on and start actually talking about them as a class at the beginning of class on Thursday, but this will give you a chance to start talking out your answers, and we'll proceed through those on Thursday.